Hello. So, 2023 is the year that investors and startups have really begun to tout the advancements in artificial intelligence and where this technology is breaking new ground. A lot of that hype has been focused around Silicon Valley, but we're here today to talk about what it could potentially mean for Europe and what sort of startups there are in Europe that are breaking ground themselves in this space. So firstly, we have Ben Blume from Atomico. He's a partner at in the investment team at Atomico, and he leads investments in enterprise software SaaS companies. Before Atomico, Ben spent time as a software engineer at Bank of America Merrill Lynch and a consultant at Bain & Company. He's been working on investments in automation, digital work, and enterprise data. And we also have Rebeca Tristan, who is the head of operations at Pigment, a business planning platform that boasts clients like Deliveroo, Klarna, and Figma. Pigment leverages data and AI to provide enterprises with decision-making software. Rebeca oversees the operations at Pigment as well as the people and customer teams. And before working at Pigment, she worked at Meta and at LinkedIn. So good to have you both here today. What we're focusing on today is the role that Europe is going to be playing in investment in AI and also how AI will develop on the continent and also in the UK going forward. And so we're starting today with a poll that we'll discuss at the end, but we'd love for all of you to give your own opinion on this. We want to talk about where can Europe be a leader in AI. And of course, we know about the European AI Act, and we know that AI regulation is going to be a core part of Europe's focus on AI, but also potentially you may think that developing ways to apply AI, such as Pigment, is the way that Europe can excel, or should we be building our own models? Should we be trying to compete with the likes of OpenAI or Bard? So let's start there. Microsoft's giant investment in OpenAI, Google's launch of Bard, and Meta's Llama 2. We've seen a huge amount of big tech players invest a huge amount of money in this technology in the last several months. And so why don't we start there? Where does Europe ensure it will be a creator of this technology as opposed to just a user of big tech's technology?
Thanks. It's a great and important question, and I think probably sets the tone for a lot of the kind of nuances we can take the discussion in. But I think first thing to say is if you continue the list onwards from the names you started with, there's also some amazing European companies already in that list, Mistral and Aleph Alpha and others. So there's lots of money going into European origin foundation model, large language model companies, as well as the kind of big tech companies, which is great to see. I think what's also important is to think about what really is important, what really matters to be built from Europe, and what we actually are really talking about. And I think what's very exciting to see is that even if the kind of forefront and the most funding for those kind of foundation and kind of fundamental model companies is with the big tech players, I think the amount of innovation of kind of at the application level of people using this technology to solve real world problems and build real commercially valuable applications is already kind of well ahead in Europe as well.
And maybe just to add to that, I mean, maybe unpopular opinion, and I know it's part of the poll, but this is my personal opinion, but I don't believe that there's a lot of value in focusing on building a model from scratch. And I know we are doing that. There's a lot of investment going into that. But if we can leverage that to build really strong applications and be ahead of the curve, I think this is where Europe will thrive and where I would focus on my efforts, because we don't have the luxury of all of the years and years of data and money that these companies in big tech have. So maybe in line of that with regulation, and I know this is a big topic we're going to talk about today, but if we are able to protect a way that not only big tech benefits from the use of AI, this is where Europe being the first continent to regulate, we're going to be much more ahead of the curve in that regard.
And we've been hearing this saying over and over again in the tech scene in the last year that in a few years saying we use AI will be like saying now we have an app. And both from the perspective of Pigment as a company that is applying AI right now and as an investor with Atomico, how do you make sure that you're able to still stay ahead of something that is going to become so ubiquitous that investing in it now or developing it now may just be par for the course in a couple of years?
Yep.
Go for it.
I mean, I'm happy to start, but I think there's, it's kind of, to your point, as building an app, this is just going to become something that every company is doing. Right now, it's a little bit of a buzzword, and there's a lot of ways in which companies are doing AI, and a lot of it, it's in a way quite fake, and so we have to be, first of all, when we're thinking about building AI, is making sure that there's a useful use of the application and there's trust. And I think this is the biggest thing that we can invest in right now for our teams and companies, and it's how we're building it at Pigment. But if we don't have trust, of course, people are not going to use it. How do we create that trust? First is, of course, with the people, the talent behind that is building it. They not only have to be skilled at using AI and learning that quickly, but also building it the right way. So responsibly being conscious about how we are going to be using this technology, but then also in terms of the data systems behind it. So for example, in Pigment, we're quite lucky because we are using only our customers' data for their own use. So there's no external kind of inaccurate data, if you will, because they're using their own data, their own models that they've cleaned up and leveraged. But if we think about maybe like opening that up and where it could be an issue, and I was telling Aggi this story, but this week alone, a University of Chicago released an AI poison called Nightshade. I don't know if you've heard about it already, but basically it's to protect the artist's copyright. So they're embedding this into their work, and what it does is that it tricks learning models to basically, pollute the data, and it could have crazy negative effects in the accuracy of data. And so this is where, if we're not careful, if we don't build the right systems of data checks and infrastructure, as much as you can say you have AI, if you don't have an investment in the foundational work, you're not going to build something useful. So this is where I think, again, Pigment is quite luxury in the sense that we have the data of our customers, and that's what we're doing. But if we're thinking more opening up to the world, you have to be very careful.
Yeah, and I think, from an investor perspective, I think it's about really looking at places where you can apply this kind of pretty transformational and extremely powerful technology, either where you've got access to a lot of proprietary data that you can do something really differentiated with, or where you take it into a domain where that domain is otherwise technical and complex, and where it's not as easy to get started. So if I kind of give an anecdote, when these technologies were really kind of coming to the first wave of the forefront earlier this year, we spent the first few months looking at, what would it look like to have PowerPoint with AI in it, or what would it look like to have Notion with AI, or Miro with AI, or whatever else it was. And there was a whole wave of companies that cropped up in the first few months that were pitching that and raised lots of money. But what was extremely apparent very quickly was that those incumbent vendors, to call them that, were able to very quickly deploy this technology into their own products, because as well as being extremely powerful, it's actually, relatively, it's extremely easy to implement and get kind of effective performance from. And so, what we very quickly moved to is looking at, what does it look like if we take this into medical domains, or into engineering and manufacturing domains, or otherwise, where the domain is more complex. There's lots more kind of complex data and kind of internal data, but where the results can have similar impact, but actually therefore create a lot more commercial value.
Talking about the idea of should Europe develop its own large language models, maybe there's a way of us looking at that in a more focused way, as opposed to building a large language model that is a competitor to Bard or another big tech player. Is there a space in which specific industries, thinking about the health sector, as you just mentioned, the defense sector, are there specific industries where actually developing your own large language model is not only an investment case for it, but also a strategic case for it?
Yeah, and I think when we look at the kind of AI landscape, we look at the kind of general purpose foundation models for text, video, images, whatever else. And then you look at these kind of domain-specific or kind of functional foundation models, which are still kind of core models that you can build on top of, but that can achieve specific things. So, like MedPalm, or something trained on only medical data, or something that could be trained on, let's say governmental data or policy data or something similar. I think they take less, they're less expensive to build because you can train on narrower data sets. You don't need to train these things on the entire internet, and therefore it's more achievable to build that without $10 billion of funding. And then also, if you look at that in a kind of national or European domain, you get the value of training that only on kind of local data and tuning that for what it makes sense to kind of look at in a kind of European or kind of country by country perspective. And so I think that's a great thing to do. I think, also if you look at then more strategic areas like defense, where, we might want proprietary models that are, closed or within one ecosystem, I think it's a sort of similar argument to make.
And Rebecca, when you're looking at the enterprise software that you're offering to companies, it seems like a lot of the companies that you work with are startups or growth stage companies that are already in themselves digital natives. What industries do you think it will be much harder to transform with AI, like the AI that you're providing? Because perhaps they're not digitized enough, or because it's just something that is so foreign to this industry?
Yeah, so I think I kind of think a lot about maybe defense, health. Those are the areas that will be quite difficult, I think, to provide something that's quite as open as this and leverage that. I also think in terms of difficult, I definitely think the creative space is something that is very difficult to automate and change at that level. So I would say that's kind of the high-level industries. In terms of our customer base, and I think as with any technology, digital transformation is difficult. And so the more the company is avoidant and not as comfortable with change management, innovating, they will struggle. I think the world is full of examples of companies that, were at the top of their game, thinking like, I don't know, Kodak, and then just completely disappeared. And so I think that applies to any sort of digital transformation. But this is, if I think of our customer base, of course, the early adopters are kind of fast-moving companies that are embracing this change and are comfortable with that.
But I think that also goes in really nicely to your statement before, like, what will happen when AI is like having an app, right? I think in the end, the technology will kind of fade into the background, and what will become important is, can you deploy that technology in a way that it's extremely usable, that is extremely accessible to your target user group? And I think that solves the problem, right? When we stop or we move away from the point where everyone has, made with AI on the front page of their website and on all their marketing materials, and it's an assumed technology as part of the stack, and again, it becomes, really more about results, about, the impact it's going to have on your business, then people. And I think the stigma around AI has really shifted over the last. I think 3 or 4 years ago, the questions on this panel would have been, is everybody really scared of AI? Are people still thinking about the Terminator? Now I think people understand and have seen in the last year, particularly, there is real impact and the fear is gone. But I agree. Slow-moving traditional companies are still. Everyone wants an AI strategy. That's coming down from the board, but it still feels a lot like there's kind of a lot of noise about people saying, we want to be seen to be doing something here, and then when it comes to actually signing contracts, people are a lot slower. But I think hopefully, if you again produce really valuable products that people can really see the benefit from, then AI or not, I think that's going to be the kind of primary thing and ease adoption into any industry.
And with Atomico, what do you think is a challenge that you haven't really seen be secured? You haven't really seen an AI company that is really tackling something that you're looking for as an investor?
I think what's really exciting is that we're seeing AI applied to kind of all of the domains we look at. So whether it's, we just invested in a company bringing AI into kind of warehouses and logistics. We invested in a company building, that's called Dexter, a company called Corti, who is putting AI as a kind of clinical co-pilot. We have AI in a company called DeepL doing AI translation. Like, we're really seeing AI in such a wide range of industries. And, everywhere we look, every time we pick off a new problem, we're seeing companies. For example, new materials development, that's an area that's, a pretty frontier topic for us. And you see companies, amazing teams out of DeepMind and others who are taking that problem and charging forward with it. So I can't actually think of an area that we're not seeing this technology applied in. I think the technology is moving so fast, the kind of innovation is moving so fast, it's almost a bit of a race of what can you do with the newest technologies as they kind of improve. But that's an exciting thing to see, I think.
And we'd be remiss to talk about AI in Europe and not talk about the European AI Act and efforts to regulate it. Of course, this was actually something that the EU had been working towards before the current hype around the technology. And so I'm curious, do you think there's any benefit for Europe being first out of the gate in this form of regulation?
So on my view, there is, and I'll Ben go after, but the fact that we are the first, it means that we're going to be building with these constraints in mind in a way. We're going to think about it from the beginning. We're going to be more responsible. And I think the key here, which is something that in a way we've maybe learned from GDPR, and we've learned in different ways that Europe has gone ahead on this, that it has to be a balance, and we're not going to get it perfect, and we're going to have to, everyone will be uncomfortable in some ways, but it has to be simple, so something that everyone can understand and apply. It has to allow enough time for companies to adapt whatever the regulations will be. And it also really needs to make sure that it doesn't exclude the little players out there, and this is where maybe the big tech can be quite a, in a way, a fear of mine, in a sense. I was thinking about like Spotify, where they say that they couldn't be successful if they were made today because obviously Google and Apple control the distribution. And so if that's going to be the case of the big tech and we don't regulate it in a way and we just allow only the companies that have a lot of deep pockets and money to play, we're not going to achieve what we want. But if we do it in a way simple and constructively enough, we will definitely be ahead of the game from everyone else who will be trying to then adjust, which I think, having been at Meta as well, for example, like it's very difficult to kind of shuffle once you've gone down a very deep path. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I see things totally the same way, right? It's you need to have clear, simple frameworks. You need to take into, you need to have consultation with all of the relevant stakeholders so that you hear those views as you kind of produce those frameworks, those policies, and then, long term, it's of benefit. If companies are born into a clear regulatory environment, they have a kind of a clean playing field to kind of build from, and then there's not a kind of hard point down the line where suddenly you've got to adjust to regulation coming kind of left, right, and center at you. In the short term, can it be an impediment if somebody else can move faster in a less regulated environment? Possibly. I think if you look at potentially, some of the computer vision technology in China, where you might say with less regulation, the technology's gone a lot further, a lot faster. It's probably a case study of that. But I think, overall, I think the benefits are clear, and I think Europe has, in the end, in things like GDPR, has been shown to produce good policy that has been adopted or kind of similarly adopted elsewhere. So there's a good path. I think we'll have to see how it goes when the kind of final versions of this stuff come out.
Criticism I've heard about the European AI Act is that by regulating it through the applications of the technology as opposed to through the way that the technology is developed, trying to make the act technologically agnostic, it's been characterized to me as it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole, where basically every single time there's a new technology, a new application, you have to reassess, you have to regulate each new application, which creates a huge burden on regulators, but also on people innovating who will maybe not be going into every new application blind. I'm curious what you guys think of that. Do you think that it's a good strategy to be regulating the applications as opposed to the underlying technology?
I think it's very hard. Well, it's hard to put regulation anywhere, as you say. If you try and regulate the end applications, it's a bit of a whack-a-mole. If you try and regulate the technology itself, it's quite hard to know where to draw those, how to even do that, right? And I think, as more and more of this technology comes from open source as well, it becomes even harder to, regulate open source communities, let alone big tech. I think looking at some of the, the most recent language in the kind of versions of this act, I think this idea of coming somewhere in between and regulating kind of classes of applications. So is it augmenting a human decision? And if so, that's less regulation because it's not making a decision on its own, or is it doing a kind of high risk versus low risk decision? And I think that if you can sensibly draw up kind of classes and categories, and then, in anything that's broadly more safe, allow a little bit more kind of self-certification of that, I think that again starts to feel like the right direction. It's challenging, right? That's why this stuff is taking years to draw up. But I like that idea of trying to take common themes that are somewhere between the kind of fundamental technology and end applications and say, this is how the regulation applies to those kind of categories, rather than this is how it applies if you're trying to do credit application processing.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more on that. Maybe just one thing I'll add in terms of the infrastructure and the technology behind, and we spoke about this also on the break, but around just copyright infringement, protecting the law of people when we're talking about getting all of this data from the open internet. So I think that would be more of what I would like us to see regulated, and then going more into this kind of application of, is it health, is it defense, is it very high risk, or is it something, I don't know, like music choices? And so that's how I would think about it.
And just before we go to the poll, I wanted to ask you guys as well. We've heard AI be referred to as the latest hype cycle, and that has, of course, brought with it massive valuations. Of course, you've also raised money this year, among many other AI-focused companies. What do you think the risk is of characterizing AI as the latest hype cycle and see these huge valuations for some of these startups?
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, as with anything, you have to have substance behind. And so I think that's one of the things when we first started thinking about Pigment AI, was that we didn't want it to be a buzzword. Like, we really thought long and hard about how could our customers benefit from it. There was a very, quick prototype, and we tested that with our customers really early on. They've actually been part of the beta. And so I think the key of this and not being just a hype is that there definitely has to be value behind it. And so I would just cautious, I guess, companies that are just building something to kind of, plaster and just put AI behind it. We were, of course, very fortunate that, through that we had our Series C investment, and AI was definitely a part of that story of when we were telling the narrative and our investors were looking to invest. They were very pleased to see, and I think very pleased to see the testimonial and outcome from our customers, which was I think, I'm sure what you guys are looking for.
Yes.
When you're making these decisions.
Yeah, and look, I think, in my view, calling it the kind of latest hype cycle really doesn't do it justice. I think, if I think about previous kind of hype cycles, we had obviously a crypto hype cycle. You look back at things like Internet of Things, AR, VR, and smart cities, these kind of things. At times, these were all kind of waves and hype cycles. I think, personally, I've always felt this is different. I think the technology is an order of magnitude more powerful. I think it's, time to value is quicker, value across multiple areas is much clearer. And so, and there's a bunch of different views on this out there, but I think this is definitely more like, the internet and mobile than it is like crypto or VR in terms of, the order. And therefore, I think you see it as a step change technology rather than as a kind of, short-term hype bubble. That said, valuations probably do follow that kind of more kind of bubble characteristic, and there's lots of things about the dynamics of the venture industry that sort of drive that. So I wouldn't say that necessarily AI companies will maintain the valuation premiums that they currently have forever as that technology matures, but that's more a kind of fundamental of the venture industry than it is a kind of challenge with the technology itself.
Great. So I guess now we can pull up the results of the poll, see what you think. So yes, the EU has lived up to its stereotype, and in this audience, at least, people think that regulation is definitely where they can lead. It's also interesting. Applications, of course, is really the way that we're seeing a lot of this being applied, both through where investors are looking and with companies like Pigment. So that's really interesting. Thank you so much for this panel, Ben and Rebecca. This has been great. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.